Jacob Miller walked through the frozen forest, his boots crunching atop the crust of early winter snow. Pines loomed motionless under the weight of their icy coats, the light of dusk painting blue shadows across the endless expanse of silence. His gloved hands gripped his rifle, though the hunt had proven fruitless. Tracks of deer and fox skirted the edge of the wood, but for hours, Jacob's steady pace yielded only the chill biting at his face. It was at the edge of a clearing, where wind had swept bare a patch of ground, that Jacob saw the faintest movement, a trembling beneath a heap of sticks and snow. He knelt, peering closer. A snare lay there, half buried and rusted, its wire twisted tightly around the leg of a creature. A wolf pup, impossibly small, its pale fur almost indistinguishable from the wintry landscape. The animal's eyes flickered open, icy and wide as the Montana sky. Jacob's heart stilled for a moment, taken aback by their depth and reflection of pain. The pup did not snarl, did not attempt to bite. It was simply too weak, breath heavy and ragged. The leg, Jacob saw, had bled through its fur, staining the snow pink. Around them, the forest watched in its silence. Jacob felt an old, familiar war within himself. Wolves were predators, dangerous if grown. His father, and his father before him, had spoken of their threat to livestock, of the circle of survival. Yet here and now, the great instinct to destroy seemed hollow. The pup was a scrap of bone and trembling breath, far from the fearsome image painted by lore. He hesitated. A flicker of memory, the echo of laughter from another winter, the warmth and safety that once filled his cabin when his wife was alive. Loneliness pressed around him as sharp as the frost. In that moment, Jacob made his choice. With careful hands, he unwound the wire, the pup whimpering but limp in his grip. He wrapped it in his coat, cradling the fragile body against his chest, and retraced his path through the gathering darkness. The wind pressed on, relentless, but for the first time in years, Jacob felt a sense of purpose stronger than routine. The forest silence broke only by the heartbeat of the pup, the start of something he neither understood nor anticipated. At the cabin, Jacob laid the creature beside the stove and prepared water warmed with broth. He set about cleaning the wound carefully, hands sure from years of patching his own scrapes, but gentler now, guided by the weight of responsibility. The pup shifted, flinching, then settled as exhaustion weighed its frame. Night settled. Jacob watched as the wolf's breathing steadied, the possibilities of morning unknown. The danger, the risk lingered in his mind. Yet around his cabin, the wind howled, and inside, hope grew quietly in the warmth beside the fire. The first days passed in a rhythm dictated by necessity and care. Jacob awoke at dawn to a silent cabin, the pup lying curled beside the wood stove. He fashioned a soft bed from old blankets, washed and repurposed. The wounded leg demanded attention. Each morning, he cleaned it with warm water, applying salve mixed from herbs he'd gathered in better seasons. The wolf, though wary, submitted. Whimpers and growls soon gave way to resignation. Meals were a slow, cautious process. Jacob's attempts at feeding met little success at first. The pup rejected bread and vegetables, tentatively sniffed at bits of venison. Hunger eventually won, and each day the creature ate a little more, enough to keep its spirit tethered to life. Throughout, Jacob spoke quietly, not in hopes of reply, but to fill silence with reassurance. His words hung in the air like breath on cold glass, immaterial but persistent. At night, the cabin felt strange with another heartbeat pulsing within its walls. Jacob's thoughts strayed often to memories of a time before isolation, before the forest stretched endlessly around him. In the soft light of evening, he recalled winter evenings spent by the same fire, his wife's laughter echoing through the rooms. Loss felt sharper now, bordered by the presence of the wolf. The animal's behavior changed day by day. At first, distrust marked its every movement. A sudden noise sent it scurrying under chairs, eyes wide and desperate. Yet Jacob's patience wore away the edges of its fear. He moved slow, always deliberate, offering comfort in small gestures. Water poured gently, blanket arranged with care. The wolf learned to rest, to silence its trembling for moments at a time. Despite progress, Jacob understood the risk. A wild animal's nature was no simple thing to suppress. Outside, snow deepened, nights grew longer. The forest reminded him of the thin divide between safety and wildness, of instincts passed down through generations. On the fourth night, the wolf approached Jacob during supper, nose twitching at the scent of cooked meat. He placed a strip near the edge of the pup's blanket, watching as it crept forward cautiously. For the first time, it ate from his hand, teeth brushing skin with only the faintest hint of panic. Jacob lay awake for hours, listening to the even breathing of both himself and the wolf. Loneliness had not abated, but now it had altered, tempered by responsibility and the fragile hope that even in the coldest season, something new could survive. The wolf pup grew stronger with every day, its limp diminishing although the wound remained raw. The days fell into a simple pattern. Jacob stoked the fire before dawn, set about chores, and returned often to check on his unexpected companion. The forest pressed against the windows, a world unchanged and indifferent. Yet Jacob's home held something new. Trust, delicate as frost on glass, began to form. The pup ventured farther from its blanket, exploring the edges of the room. It circled the stove, drawn to warmth, occasionally stopping to sniff at Jacob's boots or the old rug worn by years. Play emerged gradually. An overturned basket, an attempt to tug at a scrap of cloth, the sudden pounce on a fallen spoon. Jacob smiled quietly, heart warming at these small victories. One evening, as wind battered the cabin walls, Jacob sat in his chair and watched the wolf chase its tail in a dizzy circle before collapsing in a heap of fur. He considered the creature's color, as white as the snows that blanketed the world outside. At that moment, the name came to him as natural as breath, White. Jacob spoke the name softly, and although the wolf did not respond, the word filled the room with intent. Giving a wild animal a name was a line crossed. One step deeper into a bond Jacob had neither sought nor expected. Despite progress, he felt an uneasy tension. Taming a creature born for the wild was no simple thing. Jacob worried about what he was shaping. Instinct could not be erased by affection alone. Still, White accepted his care, and with each evening spent by the fire, the barriers thinned. The days grew brighter as winter sunlight reflected in great sweeps across the snow. White's courage increased. Occasional forays beneath the porch, a nose pressed against the window to watch the passing deer. Jacob allowed him small freedoms. Doors opened briefly to let in the fresh air, but always with caution. Trust was a two-edged thing. The wildness in White had not vanished, only quieted. Yet for all his reservations, Jacob realized that his heart had changed. The wolf's survival, uncertain at first, became a necessity. Every moment of care was a reminder that connection, unexpected and fragile, was possible even in the loneliest winter. Winter held the land tightly, snow piling with every storm. Jacob and White settled into a shared rhythm, chopping wood at dawn, tending traps at dusk, meals eaten side by side. White's instincts sharpened. He watched eagerly at the door when Jacob returned from hunting, nose twitching at the scent of fresh game. Jacob allowed White closer to his work, teaching him the sounds and sights of the forest. He fired his rifle in the distance, watching as the wolf flinched, then gradually learned not to fear the thunder of it. Sometimes Jacob took White with him on short forays, the wolf bounding ahead through drifts, nose pressed to tracks and scents. They became a partnership, bound by necessity and growing familiarity. Still, Jacob reflected often on their differences. White's gaze, intelligent and intense, reminded him that wild creatures thrived by instinct. The cabin, comfortable as it was, could never erase the call embedded in his companion's bones. Jacob kept a respectful distance. He did not touch White unnecessarily, did not attempt to force affection. Instead, he let trust build in silence, manifested in shared space and mutual observation. At night, Jacob lay by the fire, his thoughts wandering through the depths of the forest. The wolves that howled on the far hills, the birds silent above, the cycle of survival never broken. He wondered at the nature of wildness and what it meant to invite it across his threshold. White, sleeping at the hearth, seemed untouched by these musings, his breath steady, body relaxed. On a bitterly cold morning, White followed Jacob on a hunt, tracing deer trails with quiet proficiency. The wolf did not interfere, simply matched his pace, watching and learning. When Jacob brought down a buck, White waited, respectful of the boundaries Jacob maintained. As days passed, White's confidence grew. He ventured farther into the woods, always returning by nightfall. Jacob worried about safety, about the fragility of the bridge he'd constructed between nature and home. Yet each evening, when White curled near the stove, a sense of peace settled over the cabin, distinct from the years of solitude that had preceded. Winter pressed on, fierce and relentless. Jacob and White faced the world together, two lives tethered temporarily in defiance of instinct and tradition. Spring crept into the world slowly, melting snow and softening earth. The forest woke, filled with scents and calls new to the season. With warmth came change. White grew restless, pacing the cabin, eyes fixed on the distant hills. Jacob watched, understanding the signs. The wolf's nature pulled him outward. Wild howls echoed from the mountains, distant but irresistible. White answered only with silence, but his body spoke of impatience, twitching and alert. Days passed, the urge growing. The wolf lingered less by the fire, spending long hours at the window or at the door, nose pressed against the gap. Jacob prepared for the inevitable. Freedom was not his to grant permanently, not even after months of care. With resignation, Jacob began to loosen restraint. He took White on longer excursions, eventually removing the leash entirely. They traveled deep into the woods, pausing at the edge of a high ridge. Here, Jacob knelt and spoke quietly to White, pressing his hand against the wolf's flank, a gesture of hope and farewell. That night, Jacob allowed White outside for the first time without restriction. The wolf darted off into the trees, body low to the ground, moving with a speed and grace Jacob had never seen. The hours passed. Shadow and moonlight stretched across the land. White returned at dawn, hungry and streaked with mud, but Jacob saw the change in his eyes. The wildness had awakened fully. Over the next days, this pattern repeated. White left for longer periods, but always returned. Jacob fed him, but withheld closeness. On the final evening, as twilight thickened, Jacob packed a small bundle of food and led White further into the wilderness than ever before. He waited until the wolf disappeared from sight, heart heavy with sorrow and relief. That night, The cabin felt hollow, empty in a new and unfamiliar way. The separation was not clean. White returned several times over the next weeks, appearing at the edge of the woods, hesitant and torn. Each time, Jacob repeated the process, leading him deeper into the forest, encouraging escape. The wolf understood, but the bond forged in winter was slow to break. The final parting came quietly. Jacob stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as White slipped away, no longer pausing to look back. The cabin's echoes felt different, loneliness now marked by a sense of loss, but also accomplishment. Jacob tended the fire that evening with special care, grateful for the silence, but also keenly aware of the void White left behind. The routine persisted: chores, hunts, evenings by the stove. Yet now every activity felt tinged by memory. The image of a white wolf in the snow, the sound of his movements, the intensity of their short-lived partnership. Weeks became months. The forest greened, birds returned. Jacob found himself searching tracks near the cabin after each rain, unwilling to admit how much he hoped for the wolf's return. Around him, the world shifted as it always did, but inside the cabin time moved differently. In the absence of White, Jacob became a solitary figure once more, shaped by memory and a brief, wild spark of connection. The hope for unlikely return remained, fragile but undiminished, as spring passed into summer and the cycle drew again toward the cold. The first winter without White settled over the valley with a silence deeper than Jacob had ever known. Snow fell in thick columns, blanketing the world and muting even the distant calls of birds. Inside the cabin, the routines of survival pressed onward. Would split at daybreak, small games snared in the forest, lonely meals at the same worn table. Yet everything felt altered, the hours slower and more difficult. At times, Jacob caught himself expecting the familiar sound of paws across the porch, the quiet presence by the hearth. The space where White once slept remained empty, a constant reminder that what had seemed improbable, the companionship between man and wild animal, had truly vanished. Jacob's memories drifted often to those brief months of connection, cautious trust warming into genuine sharing, silent evenings spent watching embers die, the comfort of another soul breathing nearby. Nights grew long, the cold sharper and more invasive than it had been in years. Jacob pressed closer to the stove, the loneliness persistent and palpable in the flicker of firelight. He found himself retracing old walks, searching for tracks in the freshly fallen snow, hoping despite reason to see evidence that White had returned. Hope mixed with resignation, drawn from the same well of memory. He recalled the first time White chased a deer through the snow, the light and laughter that had briefly crept back into the cabin after years of darkness. He remembered the wolf's curiosity, the change from trembling fear to tentative play. All of it was now contained in silence, in the absence that filled every room, every hour. Winter held Montana in an icy fist. Jacob moved through each day with a quiet yearning, not for rescue from loneliness, but for the understanding that some connections, rare as they were, would shape him long after they were gone. The longing for the wolf and the forest that had brought them together gave Jacob strength to face the cold and the night, no longer just as a hunter, but as a witness to something rare and almost holy. Months passed, the skies clearing only to grow leaden again as the season deepened. Jacob, settling into habit, found little ease in solitude. His grief was private. Neither the wind nor the trees acknowledged it, yet everything seemed colored by loss. The world outside pressed on, gnarled and indifferent. The routine of tending traps, mending fences, and nursing the stove became Jacob's religion. It was deep into January, on a night when the stars burned cold and the forest lay silent, that something changed. Jacob awoke to the sound of movement outside, softer than wind, lighter than any deer or bear. He paused, body tense, caught in the borderland between hope and caution. By the time he reached the porch, the snow was already marked. There, on the doorstep, lay a rabbit, its body fresh and untouched by scavengers. Jacob lowered the lantern, heart thudding between expectation and disbelief. Tracks led away from the cabin, headed toward the trees. The pattern was unmistakable, the gait that of a full-grown wolf. Jacob searched the edges of the clearing, scanning for movement, but the night yielded only shadows. For a long moment he listened to the hush of the woods, hoping to hear the deep, throaty sound of the wolf's return. What greeted him was silence. He knelt beside the rabbit, the offering a message without words. White had come back, stronger, larger, but still tethered to the memory of warmth and survival. The significance of the act was not lost on Jacob. It had meaning, gratitude, perhaps, or a reminder of their shared past. That night, Jacob barely slept. The loneliness he had felt for so many months shifted, not vanished, but transformed. Knowing White endured, living, surviving, remembering, brought an unspoken companionship once more. Jacob did not try to pursue him. The wolf belonged to the night, to the deep woods and winter's rain. And Jacob accepted the gift, the bond rekindled by the simple act of kindness. From that winter onward, a new tradition took shape. Each year, as the first heavy snows fell and the temperatures drove prey deep into the forest, White returned, always under cover of darkness, never willing to approach the light or warmth of the cabin. Jacob would wake to discover rabbits, grouse, sometimes even a deer, all laid neatly at the edge of the porch, a silent exchange between two solitary beings. Jacob learned to wait for these visits, though he never attempted to catch the wolf or force an encounter. He understood now the boundaries of trust. White's wildness was unalterable, the distance between them maintained by instinct as much as choice. Yet the gifts were enough, reminders that years spent together had created a connection that transcended seasons and circumstance. On several occasions, Jacob glimpsed White at the perimeter of the clearing, a pale silhouette against moonlit snow, eyes reflecting the darkness, body poised to flee if approached. Jacob always kept his distance, allowing White to remain a creature of forest and night. Their relationship was shaped by respect, an understanding that nearness was both a privilege and a risk. Over time, the regularity of these visits changed Jacob's perception of winter itself. Loneliness was held at bay by the anticipation of White's appearance, the silent comfort of knowing that somewhere in the wilderness, memory persisted. The tradition became a symbol, proof of gratitude, survival, and a sustained connection neither could have named. Jacob aged, the years marked by each return of the wolf and the offerings left in the snow. The boundaries between man and wild animal were never crossed again, but the closeness they achieved was measured in loyalty and patience. Through all the silent winters, as White braved storms and Jacob endured the solitude, their story lived on in the ritual exchange that needed no words. Years passed in the steady rhythm of winter and thaw, each season lending new contours to the land and those who lived upon it. 4 or 5 winters, White's visits became the heartbeat of Jacob's solitude. The hunter, whose brown hands had split thousands of logs and whose eyes had mapped the stars over Montana for decades, slowly found his own strength waning. The woods grew thicker, shadows lengthened, the journey to and from the cabin taking a little more effort each year. Each winter, Jacob marked the passage of time by White's arrival. Sometimes the wolf appeared leaner than in years past. Sometimes he moved stiffly, scars standing out like silver threads against his pale coat. In the deep cold, Jacob would trace paw prints from the porch all the way to the tree line, seeing how White's path grew heavier, more deliberate. Jacob recognized this change as the mark of endurance, a sign that life in the wild had cost the wolf much. Battles fought, miles wandered, hunger endured. Jacob himself was not untouched. The cold seemed to seep a little deeper into his bones. His hands shook at dawn when he tried to grind coffee, and when he shouldered his rifle for the day's hunt, the weight of it felt unfamiliar and burdensome. Sometimes he thought back to the first winter without White, when his heart ached with absence. Now, every winter carried an echo of those days, but also the promise of the wolf's yearly visitation. White's gift changed too. In the hard years, when snow lay thick across the hills, he began leaving larger game. A young deer with clean, careful kill marks, a heavy pheasant. Jacob saw these as gestures, signs that White knew the old hunter's struggle had grown fiercer as well. The bond, initiated by empathy and sharpened by time, evolved, no longer a simple exchange from animal to man, but a relationship colored by mutual respect and quiet understanding. Jacob spent more time inside, watching the storms curl around the cabin windows. He was not given to nostalgia, but the sight of White, moving through the trees at the edge of the yard, his coat growing streaked with gray, his body growing heavier with age, made Jacob reflect on their history. Each shared winter, each gift placed on the porch, bound them more closely. Jacob realized his own story was written into the snow, traced by footprints and all the years spent listening to the forest. The isolation intensified, but the arrival of White, sometimes just a glimpse, sometimes only the evidence left behind, kept Jacob's mind sharp and his heart attentive. The man and the wolf, aging side by side yet apart, braved the fierce Montana winters in silent company, each struggling beneath the weight of survival and memory. The 11th winter was the hardest Jacob could remember. Early storms pressed the landscape with icy persistence, wind howling through gaps in walls where chinking had failed. Jacob fell ill, a fever settling in his body, sapping strength that had seemed so endless only years before. The struggle to maintain daily routine, fetching water, splitting wood, setting traps, grew monumental, every task a battle against weakness. Jacob spent long hours shivering by the fire, blankets wrapped around his shoulders, breath misting in the cold air. The pantry shelves thinned, traps remained unchecked. For the first time since he was a boy, Jacob worried about making it to spring. It was in the depths of this struggle, during a week when snow lay deep and hunger pressed hard, that White's visits changed once again. The wolf appeared more often, almost every night, sometimes barely visible on the edge of vision. He brought larger prey, a heavy rabbit one evening, a grouse another. Once, Jacob found a young deer lying just beyond the porch. White had dragged it close, but not too close, as if wary of shattering the line dividing wildness from domesticity. The old hunter felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. Not once in those nights did Jacob attempt to approach. He knew that respect for distance was itself a form of care. White lingered longer near the cabin during those days. Jacob would catch sight of the wolf, watching from beneath the trees, calm and patient, never calling out or coming closer. Their companionship had always been one of silence and space. Now, it became one of necessity, each tending to the other's survival in the manner of their own kind. Jacob recovered slowly, nourished by White's offerings and the persistent hope brought with each visitation. Winter pressed hard against the windows, but inside, the bond between man and wolf burned steady and strong. No words, no contact, but a connection measured by acts and endurance. Through the deepest snows and darkest nights, Jacob found the will to continue. Across the clearing, White prowled, bringing sustenance and silent caretaking. Every gift laid in the snow was an affirmation, a reminder that, even at a distance, they had become essential to one another's existence. The winter neared its end when White made the most remarkable gesture of all. One evening, as the sun slipped below the tree line and frost etched patterns on the glass, Jacob noticed movement at the edge of the yard. He rose, weary but alert, and peered through the window. Not just White, but several wolves had gathered, White's family by appearance and bearing. Jacob watched in quiet awe as White's pack approached the open space before the cabin. The younger wolves, small, limber, their coats flecked with gray and cream, bounded in the snow, rolling, chasing, their playfulness a stark contrast to the solemnity of their parents' posture. White stood a little apart, sentinel-like, always watchful, eyes locked on the cabin. Jacob did not venture outside. He understood the moment for what it was, a gift that could not be forced or repeated. For several minutes, the young wolves played, tumbling in the yard as White monitored them. Jacob felt a profound gratitude and humility. The wildness of the pack, unspoiled and free, now momentarily intersecting his own small sphere. White's gesture was clear. By bringing his family to the cabin, he was not only repaying a debt or offering sustenance, but sharing his new life, a silent acknowledgement of roots, history, and the care that had saved him as a pup. The wolves remained, never crossing the invisible line between civilization and wilderness, but for a short while, their presence filled the night with a sense of continuity, legacy, and connection. Jacob watched until the shadows lengthened and the wolves, led by White, melted once more into the forest. That night, he did not sleep for a long time. The image of the young wolves remained with him. The inherited wildness, the bond that passed not only between man and animal, but from one generation of wolves to the next. The world outside was still brutal, the cold exacting and harsh. Yet within the cabin, Jacob felt warmth more profound than fire, gratitude, memory, and the knowledge that for a fleeting time, man and wolf had both transcended the boundaries that defined them. The bond, once forged in suffering and survival, now carried forward by the family White had chosen, lived on beyond the snow and the silence. The 10th winter since Jacob first rescued White from the jaws of an old trap arrived quietly, settling the valley into its familiar stillness. The passing years were written in Jacob's movements, slower, more deliberate, a hand now trembling as it poured morning coffee. The forest outside his cabin shaped every hour, its silence occasionally pierced by distant howls, the old man's thoughts tracing memories that now spanned a decade. The bond between Jacob and White had evolved, transformed by each season endured. Jacob found himself reflecting more often on why the wolf kept returning. The gifts White left, whether a rabbit, grouse, or sometimes nothing at all, were delivered with intention, with a dignity that marked them as more than simple acts of animal instinct. Jacob understood, at last, the truth. White's offerings were not payment for food or shelter once given, nor gestures of domestication, but something deeper, a matter of gratitude and remembrance that had come to define them both. Jacob remembered the first fearful winter, when White had clung to warmth and safety as their friendship was forged in necessity. He recalled painful moments, letting White go, watching him return only in the distance, sometimes never at all. Now, after years of silent exchange, Jacob realized that what bound them was no longer a question of need, but of duty willingly accepted. White's motivation was clear: not just animal loyalty, but repayment for care that had stretched beyond mere survival. When White appeared at the porch, Jacob saw wisdom in his eyes, an understanding of what had passed between them. The wolf had become caretaker in his own way, remaining wild but forging connection through ritual and distance. Jacob's mind wandered to the heart of the winter woods, to the balance between wildness and tenderness that had marked their relationship. Each silent visit was weighted with meaning, proof that the choices made so long ago had carried forward, echoing in tracks through snow and the comfort found near the fire. The aging hunter sat long before the stove, the world outside shifting beneath waves of snow and cloud. He knew that what White offered now was not simply food, but an acknowledgement, the thread of memory stretching not just across time, but across the divide between body and spirit, between man and nature. This bond, born of suffering and gratitude, had grown into something lasting, a partnership built on acts, not words. Jacob finally understood. Their story was woven not of necessity alone, but of a duty to each other, as enduring as the Montana winter and as gentle as the hush of falling snow. Winter's grip tightened once more, harsher than in recent memory. Jacob, now far older than when the story began, felt the resonance of each passing storm. Illness pressed sometimes against his chest, and he depended increasingly on the regularity of White's visits. In these deep, cold months, the limits of their bond were tested not by absence, but by the prospect of finality. White returned in late January, his presence unmistakable, a pale shadow at the tree line, standing where the yard met the thickness of the woods. Jacob saw instantly that something had changed. The wolf moved with visible effort, his gait weighted with age and fatigue. Scars lined his muzzle, and his once lustrous coat had faded to silver. Yet White came, as he always did, carrying a gift. This time a large grouse, left carefully on the porch. But instead of disappearing into the night, White lingered. Jacob watched through the frosted glass as the wolf remained near the cabin, his breath visible in the frigid air. Time seemed to stretch, the old hunter and his companion separated by only a door, yet bound by years of wordless understanding. Jacob rose and wrapped himself tight against the cold before stepping onto the porch. White did not flee. Rather, he remained, eyes fixed upon Jacob, body still but trembling. Silence stretched as long as either could bear. In the pale blue light of late winter, two old friends gazed at one another, each recognizing in the other the weight of time, the pain of endurance, the strength of connection. There are no sounds save for the wind and slow, deliberate breathing. Jacob stood as long as he could, his heart full of sorrow but also gratitude. The moment, unspoken, long withheld, became a farewell only when White finally turned and shambled into the woods. Jacob remained on the porch, long after White's shape disappeared in the shadows. He knew, with the certainty of one who had watched seasons change and bonds form, that this visit had been different. It was marked by finality, by the knowledge that the future was uncertain. The hunter returned indoors, carrying the heaviness of goodbye. That night, the wind battered the cabin walls, and Jacob lay in bed searching for sleep. The absence of White pressed harder than ever before, yet in the slow comfort of memory, the old man found peace. Their story, regardless of its ending, was built upon mutual endurance, two lives tied together against the world outside. Spring's promise lingered on the far side of winter, but for now the world remained locked in snow and silence. Jacob tended the fire, gathered what stores remained, prepared for the cold as best he could. Days stretched, and though the routine of living alone was unchanged, the air inside the cabin was different. Not empty or hopeless, but tinged with longing and expectation. Jacob did not know if White would ever return. The wolf's last visit had left a question in its wake, hovering in every quiet hour and beneath every star. The ritual of searching for paw prints in the snow, of listening for distant howls, became both habit and comfort. Hope was no longer frail or desperate, but a quiet certainty. Some ties, forged in hardship and strengthened by kindness, endured beyond logic or circumstance. The beauty of the forest pressed upon Jacob's senses. He watched the snow fall, sometimes gentle, sometimes raging, and remembered the years marked by footsteps at his door. He understood now that what had passed between himself and White was not only gratitude, nor only duty, but the memory of hearts shared for a time, strong and silent as frost. Jacob prepared for the new winter, stacking wood, checking traps, moving through the methodical patterns that had shaped his life. Solitude remained, but loneliness did not. The world outside was vast and untamed, but inside the cabin and within Jacob's memories, something eternal had been built. The first snow of the season fell in blue darkness, blanketing the world. Jacob stood at the window, listening to the wind and the hush of night. In the silence, he heard the faintest echo, footsteps across crusted ice, the promise of presence returned. Jacob smiled, knowing that even if the binding had ended, its echo would persist. The connection between man and wolf, once improbable, now eternal, lived on in memory and in the heart of a forest ready to begin another year.